Now we move into our final unit, and this final unit is titled Into the 21st Century, from 2001 to present. And this really will cover the presidencies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And so we start here with our learning objectives. Explain the issues that made the 2000 presidential election so controversial. Describe how September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks changed the world. And describe the effects of the subprime mortgage crisis. And describe the major issues of the 2008 presidential election. So starting by looking at the 2000 presidential election. As we mentioned previously, Vice President Al Gore was running for the Democratic Party nomination and received the Democratic Party nomination, and he ran against then Texas Governor George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who was Clinton's predecessor. And so Bush ran, of course, as the Republican candidate. So there were numerous problems with this 2000 presidential election. Number one, Al Gore actually wins the popular vote, but loses in the Electoral College. It's the Electoral College that determines the president. That's the way the Constitution was set up. It's the way it's always been. Normally, the candidate who wins the Electoral College also wins the popular vote. Once in a while, that doesn't happen, and when it doesn't happen, it always becomes controversial. And of course, obviously, this is no exception. But adding to the controversy are numerous problems that surface. On election night, before the polls were closed on the West Coast, the media was projecting Al Gore as the winner. A short time later, they revised their call and projected Bush as the winner. The election came down to the state of Florida. Whichever candidate took Florida would win the election. The election was very close in Florida. Late in the evening, it was announced that George W. Bush had won the election, and as news crews waited for Gore's concession speech, it was announced that Gore was not conceding. There were numerous problems with the voting, and Gore was requesting recounts in select counties in Florida. There were numerous ballot problems. One included the infamous butterfly ballots, and they also were what we call punch card ballots. The punch card ballots used in Florida could lead to several problems with regards to interpreting the will of the voter. Some ballots were not completely punched, leaving what becomes known as dangling chads, which is basically just a little piece that isn't punched all the way out. And then there becomes a problem interpreting the will of the voter. If there's a hole there, if the punch card has been completely punched, that clearly counts as a vote. If there's no evidence that anybody attempted to punch at all, then there's no vote. But what do you do if one's partially punched? Does that count? Well, how far punched does it have to be? Does an indentation count? All of these things have to be considered. And a lot of you may not recall this. In modern elections, we now tend to use what's a little closer to a Scantron. You kind of bubble in a little box. But on those old punch card machines, you actually had to insert your ballot into the punch card, and there was a lever that went up and down, and you had to kind of lock it into the right position. And when you were locked there and ready to cast your vote, you pressed down on the handle, and it punched out the little chad. Well, Florida's ballot was even more difficult because theirs is what you call a butterfly ballot, where they had candidates listed on both sides with little arrows that pointed to different lines in the middle. And quite literally, it should alternate. So the first candidate would be the top hole, the second hole would be for the candidate on the right, on the top, and then the next one would be the next candidate on the left, next candidate on the right. But it would be very easy for somebody to cast a ballot to mark for the wrong spot. And of course, this becomes tremendously confusing for people because, once again, when you notice a weird anomaly, a lot of votes for a candidate that normally you wouldn't expect to do very well. Is it because people marked the wrong spot thinking they were voting for someone else? That becomes an issue. And so, like I said, there were numerous problems just to even try to interpret the will of the voters. And so the recounts start After the election on November 7th, hand recounts started in select counties in Florida. The original deadline for the recounts was November 14th. That gives them 1 week. You have different people working with the recounts, some Republicans, some Democrats. They oftentimes bicker and don't agree. Television coverage was full of people holding up the ballots to the light to see if there was any indication of an intent to cast a vote. And the whole thing ends up, it just drags on. Eventually, they extend the deadline for the recounts by the Florida Supreme Court. They agree to extend that deadline out until November 26th. Of course, that date comes and goes. The battle over the recounts persisted until on December 12th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the recounts must stop, ultimately determining that they weren't going to be able to actually recount all of the ballots within a reasonable time frame, and therefore if they couldn't complete all the recounts, then they couldn't really count any of the recounts. The original tally had to stand. The original tally left Bush with the most votes in Florida. He wins Florida. He wins in the Electoral College despite not winning the popular vote. So Bush is declared the winner. But of course this leaves many people, over half the people that voted for Al Gore. They feel disenfranchised. And once again, there was a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, who's run a few times, but his best showing really was in that 2000 presidential election. Common belief is that he most likely pulled votes away from Al Gore because he certainly is much more liberal. He would have pulled votes probably that would have otherwise went to Gore. So that ultimately is really what determines this election.